Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth, where we explore the real stories and ideas shaping the world. Today, we're joined by best-selling author and former Navy SEAL, Jack Carr, to discuss his newest novel and the realities it brings to light. But first, two headlines. Israel has launched a major ground offensive into Gaza City as the conflict escalates, and FBI Director Kash Patel is set to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee amid ongoing high-profile investigations. Let's get to the conversation. Jack, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is amazing. I'm glad we connected here because I'm in Morocco in a hotel room with some spotty Wi-Fi, and I just wasn't so sure. So it's great to see you. And right after this, I zip back to set and continue filming this fight scene between Chris Pratt and Luke Hemsworth over there as James Reece and Jules Landry. So it's looking pretty good. So but excited to talk to you. This is great.
I hope you can tell them that they need to shift their diet to look more like me and less like them. But I want to start by talking about Cry Havoc. It's been described, I read somewhere, as your most intensely researched book. What was sort of the hardest truth you uncovered about the Vietnam War during your research that most people don't realize? I think when people think Vietnam, they think of just Ken Burns and Forrest Gump, to be honest.
Yep. There's a lot of that. My understanding of the Vietnam War was first shaped by popular culture, I would say, by movies of the 70s and 80s, and then thrillers of the 70s and 80s as well, where protagonists oftentimes had backgrounds as, let's say, Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, CIA paramilitary, Marine snipers in Vietnam, and now in the 80s, they're a private investigator or a police officer and using those skills to solve problems in what was then a contemporary thriller, or even on TV, same type of a thing. And then as I got a little older, probably 11, 12, 13, I really started diving in to the Vietnam War as much as I could back then in the 80s. Got the Vietnam Experience, Time Life books, reading every autobiography that I could find on someone who had spent time in Vietnam. There was that On Strategy book that came out around then that was very popular, with a certain take on the war. And then in doing this research, I guess I was aware of it, but not in the sense that it was an overriding thought, meaning that I had heard that there was a lot of support for the Vietnam War, but because of just the influx of all these other documentaries and TV shows and things that focus on the protests, I wasn't really aware of how much support there actually was, really through 1968, even like 69, 68, even it was still strong. And I thought at 68, the bloodiest year of the war, of the conflict, I thought that was really a turning point, or that's what I've been told. But in doing the research, you find out that there really was a lot of support still for the war. So that was interesting. Looking more into the domino theory, you're just told that that's kind of a fallacy. But then when you actually deep dive into this and you look at the countries surrounding, not necessarily Thailand, but other ones around there, you can see, how someone in a position in a think tank, or perhaps a politician, or a military strategic thinker, somebody like that at that time could have really thought that this domino theory had some weight to it and was legitimate. And when you go back and put yourself in their shoes and study everything up until 1968 and just take that information as your lens, then you can really see how a lot of people were on essentially that train. So I learned a lot because I was looking at everything through the lens of 1968. I wasn't just saying these guys are listening to Creedence Clearwater Revival and then just dive into a book that is essentially the same as other books I've written, but it takes place in 1968. No, I had to research every character's background, whether it's a French doctor who's in his 60s. So he has his life experience up to 1968. How is he in Saigon as a French doctor? Well, his worldview is informed by World War II and these other things. How about a 70-year-old GRU, so Soviet intelligence officer? What's his worldview? What's a 25-year-old Navy SEAL on his third deployment? What's his worldview? And so all of those different perspectives really took a lot more time than I thought. And when it came to research, and that's why it became the most heavily researched book to date, and why it's coming out in October instead of June as originally planned.
Well, I want to talk a bit more about this. You mentioned that you were surprised that there was still public support for the war in 1968. A lot of people, Pentagon veterans, will tell you that if it wasn't for a lack of public support, the war could have been won. Did you find that in your research, that the war could have been won? And what would a win look like, frankly?
Right. So, now we're looking back on things with 2020 hindsight, all the 50 plus years later, which is important to do to draw out lessons. But what I was doing, I was trying to stay rooted in 1968. So could the war have been won? I mean, you can ask that about any war that has been lost. So the answer usually would be yes, if you make different decisions along the way. I think it is, but it could have been. But at the same time, warfare had shifted between the end of World War II and what we see in Vietnam. It's continued to evolve today, meaning that I don't know if I should say very rarely. Well, we don't see the type of bombing campaigns that we saw in World War II against civilian populations or against military targets that are surrounded by civilian populations, where back in World War II, that was the order of the day when it came to Germany and Japan specifically. So if you did, I mean, that's something that is not on the table today, I would say, or wasn't for the last 20 years anyway, in Iraq and Afghanistan. You didn't see carpet bombing campaigns of Kabul and Baghdad. You saw targeted strikes as close as we could get with the best technology available, trying to target individuals or institutions, locations, airfields, that sort of thing. But you didn't see this just mass wave of bombing campaigns meant to turn that populace against their own government in order to get an unconditional surrender. So had you applied that, a horrible strategy to modern warfare or to Vietnam, I don't know the answer. But certainly, if you made different decisions along the way, a different outcome was possible.
Okay. Of course, it is coming out in October. And I recall, right, Targeted Beirut was your first nonfiction?
First nonfiction with James Scott, Pulitzer Prize finalist, amazing guy.
Friend of the
learned
show.
So much from him as far as research goes, how to correctly research, legally research and annotate and do all those notes. And because even though this is essentially Cry Havoc turned into historical fiction, and I have a lot of history woven into my other novels, if I make a mistake, I can always just say, hey, it's fiction. Let's go with it. But in nonfiction, you cannot do that. You have to, everything has to be right. Everything has to be annotated. And I learned so much from James Scott about that over the last few years working on Targeted Beirut. And we're working on the next one right now and should announce that probably in the next few months or maybe early next year, that topic. And it'll probably come out late 2026 or 2027.
Yeah. Well, with Cry Havoc, what can readers expect?
So this is a time machine, essentially back to 1968. And some of those books that I read growing up as contemporary thrillers are now my time machine back. If I want to revisit, let's say, Hunt for Red October, or I want to revisit The Brotherhood of the Rose by David Morrell, or The Charm School by Nelson DeMille, or Last of the Breed by Louis L'Amour, something like that, that takes me back to the 80s, even though they were contemporary thrillers at the time. And maybe some of my books that are contemporary thrillers will be time machines for people looking back on this current time. But this one, going back to 1968, was a completely different experience for me. And hence all that research, trying to get the gear right for these guys in Mac V Sog, who were essentially fighting a secret war going across the border into Cambodia, Laos, North Vietnam, and trying to honor those guys that stood up and went down range and came home in a time where they didn't have the support that we had coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I wanted one of those guys to read it and at least know that I put the effort into trying to capture the feel of 1968. And I also wanted people who lived through that time frame, who didn't go to Vietnam, but were here in another capacity in the United States or even internationally, to know that I put in the effort to try to get that feel of 1968 right. What was the tone in the world? Where were we at with the Cold War? I kick off the book in chapter 1 with the capture of the USS Pueblo. And I think everything in there is how that happened, from all the research that I did. And I did a ton of research into that chapter. Not the longest chapter, but certainly one of the most well-researched of the book. And I think how that went down is accurately portrayed in chapter 1 of this novel. So that really kicks off 1968 for people. And then we have Martin Luther King, we have Bobby Kennedy, we have the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, we have all these riots, we have LBJ saying he's not running for re-election. So all these hits one after another through 1968, and then Nixon elected, of course, really as a result of all of these events. It's just an incredible time in American history. And for whatever reason, I was always drawn to the 60s, probably because of the Vietnam movies I saw growing up, the books that I read growing up, the music of the time that really spoke to me as a kid. It was my parents' generation. So I think that really spoke to me because it had such an impact on them. John F. Kennedy assassination had such an impact on them. So that became a part of my experience as well, just growing up in that household. So it's a time machine back to 1968, and is essentially an espionage thriller dropped into the heart of Saigon in this bloodiest year of the war. There are a couple other books that have done it in the past. I drew inspiration from Graham Greene, and The Quiet American, of course, came out in the mid 50s. Also, The Tears of Autumn by Charles McCary, that came out in 1974, and The Honorable Schoolboy by Jean Le Carré, that came out in 1977. But those are the only ones that I'm aware of that dropped espionage thrillers into Southeast Asia during that time frame. So from the end of World War II up to the end of Vietnam, essentially, and then a couple post-war years for the Le Carré novel. But that's what it is. It's an espionage thriller dropped into the heart of Saigon.
So, look, in Targeted Beirut, you told the life story of a doctor from, I believe he was from Tennessee. He was roughly 25 or 26, who survived and then had sort of, his life was impacted forever. And then the families of those who were killed in the bombing, in the barracks bombing in the early 80s. How do you think the U.S., when it comes to policy, is treating its veterans now? Are we doing better than we did with Vietnam? When people came back and were spit on the streets, they didn't get care. I'll tell you, Jack, I had breakfast with a friend of mine yesterday who's a veterans attorney. Every day he's dealing with Vietnam vets calling with serious issues to this day. That's not going anywhere. We still have a generation of people like yourself who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. How are we doing treating our veterans today?
I think much better than we have in any time in our history, and not necessarily. I mean, the government's trying, but it's a gigantic bureaucracy, and that is of course just what a gigantic bureaucracy is. It's hard to navigate. So a lot of the non-governmental type organizations, the foundations, the charities, those sorts of things, I can see really making an impact with people that figure out how to navigate that landscape. Essentially, it still takes some doing, but there are so many options for people that weren't available to our Vietnam veterans when they came home. So many people out there willing to help and support, whether it's traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, physical and emotional trauma of the battlefield, or just trying to find your place in the world, your next purpose as you move on to another phase of life, as you support a family, maybe. So there's a lot more resources out there than there were in the 60s and 70s for these guys who came home. And even during the 80s, when you had guys that came back from Beirut, the guys who lived through that had been digging for their friends through the rubble with their bare hands, with a K-bar knife, with a shovel or a crowbar. And then they came home, and because that was the largest loss of life for the Marine Corps since Iwo Jima in World War II, the Marine Corps really wanted to move on from that very quickly. And I don't think the veterans really, one, got their due, and then two, didn't get the support they needed when they got back from that traumatic event. And that is heartbreaking. And veteran after veteran told me on book tour that how much this book meant to them, Targeted Beirut, because we're really telling their story. And they really hadn't felt that there's something that had done that before. So it was a lot of hugs, a lot of tears, a lot of family members who lost loved ones that day, parents, sisters that came through and just gave us hugs, showed us photos of their loved one that they lost, took photos together, and then a lot of thanks. And it was just a very emotional book tour. It was very emotional to write, but being on a book tour was even more emotional, being able to talk to the guys who survived and just hear from them how much this book meant to them. So it was an honor to do.
Yeah, this may sound political, and it's not in any ways praise or criticism, but Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of War, has been talking for about 7 months about the new generation of warfighters. How do you think they will be different from those who are fighting in places like Vietnam and in Beirut and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, both in terms of technology and in mindset? And help our listeners understand what he means when he talks like this. If anyone would know, it's likely you. What are the goals, and what does he think that we are not doing correctly for our troops?
Yeah, I don't know what specifically he's talking about when it comes to the next generation of warfare, but when it comes to technology, wow, we saw such leaps over the 20 years that we were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then what we're seeing now with the 6th generation fighters that are coming out on this side of the house, where you still have a pilot, but you have a, sorry about that. That means my other interview is coming up. It's on warning.
No worries.
But as you're seeing autonomous drones launched from manned aircraft as part of this new F-47. So, of course, you have all of that. Of course, you have new battle spaces that have existed over the past 20 years, but not the way they are today, not the way they can be utilized today. So, as we all know, tools can be used for good or for ill. and we're talking about cyber warfare, and we're talking about artificial intelligence, and we're talking about satellites and what's going on upstairs, the Kessler effect. In my last book, I talked a lot about that. Red Sky Mourning is the debris field that could prevent us from communicating or launching new satellites for decades if those different layers of satellites are exploited in a way that in which they are vulnerable right now. But when it comes down to the war fighter, when it comes down to that person, of course you're gonna have people behind computer screens. But when it comes to those people that have to go out, well, that mindset really has not ever changed. Meaning you're fighting there, you have a mindset, you're there for the person to your right and your left. You're trying to be the best operator, the best leader you can possibly be, not just for them, but for their families back home. That's what you owe those people back home. And the mission in the country at large is to be as prepared as you can possibly be. So the mindset of a modern day warrior remains the same: how to adapt, how to capitalize on momentum, how to look for gaps in the enemy's defenses, how to be prepared and as educated as you can possibly be when you step into these positions that where other people are relying on you. But this next generation of warfare, I must say that I'm glad to be watching it from the outside with all the drone technology and everything else that's out there in the space. My 20 years was it was a good fit for me when I was in. I don't know if I'd be such a good fit moving forward. Things have just advanced technologically so fast, and I like my 1988 Land Cruiser that has a key and that I can turn and doesn't beep at me when I go over the speed limit.
So you were talking about your recent book, Red Sky Mourning, and your protagonist is in the midst of a cyber war with tech-driven threats. Let's talk a bit more about what you learned in researching this and just in your own studies. And to build off of this last point, what should we expect in warfare? How much further do you think it can go? Because I think when you look back to even your time in Iraq and Afghanistan, you're right. It was kind of just you put your key in a Toyota and you have a gun and you find a mission. It seems like now even most warfare isn't fought that way, and it's not going to be fought that way moving forward. If you had to maybe speculate a little bit, but also drawing on your work and your research, what can we expect moving forward?
I think it's autonomous drones underwater, in the air, robotics on land. That's where things are headed. Also space. So all of those different mediums are going to have autonomous craft because they can make decisions faster than a human can. And if the enemy is doing that, let's say China in this case, let's just choose that. If they have autonomous drones and robots in the future, they will make decisions faster than a bureaucracy. And if they're doing that, that in turn means that we need to do that. So it's a game of constant adaptation. So if the enemy's adapting that way, then we have to have our drones making faster decisions. So what does that mean to take humans out of that decision-making process? And I know we've said, I've heard people talk about we wouldn't do that, but once again, what if the enemy does that? What if Russia does that? What if China does that? Well, just by definition, they're going to be making decisions faster than you can. And typically on the battlefield, whoever adapts faster than the enemy is going to come out on top. So that's a real problem. And if you do take humans out of that decision-making process, what does that mean for humanity? And I don't know the answer to it, but I'll be exploring it in the pages of my novels.
Wonderful. And final question for you. What lessons on resilience and decision-making do you hope that readers take away from both Cry Havoc, Targeted Beirut, and your other work?
Yeah, I think it's reading in general, not just my work, but people are reading less and less. Of course, you probably saw that article I think it was the Washington Post and the New York Times republished it a couple of weeks ago about how readers...
Jack, TikTok feels good, man.
It's the dopamine hits, I guess. It's programming of our not just our children, but us. And you're up against the most powerful companies in the history of mankind, whose goal is essentially to keep you from deep thought, to keep you out of the pages of a book. So now reading is essentially an act of revolt. Reading is an act of defiance. And I think because of podcasts, audiobooks might be the gateway to new readers, like my kids' generation, perhaps, because you're listening to something. And so it's not as big of a leap to make that transition to an audiobook where you're hearing something, obviously through the same medium. So my hope is that more people find books, but what they're getting out of those books, and a lot of people, of course, I only read nonfiction, which is wonderful, but you really in fiction, you really get to experience the world through someone else's eyes, which really helps develop a compassion and an empathy and a resilience, because as you're reading this and you're transported back into someone else's story, they're making it through something tough. They're coming up against challenges, and that becomes part of your story. That becomes part of your foundation that then can help you in life. You think about this book that you read, or something, maybe historical fiction based on a true event, whatever it might be, or just a fictional story, someone that you connected with. And that's why the power of popular culture was so important to generations previous, because those stories became part of your experience. And now you're thinking, oh, I failed this math test. Guess what? I should study a little more next time. I should go to some office hours of my professor. But you know what? It's not the end of the world. I'm not storming the beaches at Iwo Jima. Then those guys did that so that I could have the options and opportunities that I have today. So in order to honor them and appreciate them, I'm going to work a little harder, and I'm not going to let this that I'm dealing with get me down. So, and that's a very small example. Obviously, we're all going to be tested in life, and reading fiction stories can help with that. But more importantly, I think it's the empathy and compassion that you get through seeing the world through someone else's eyes, which helps in discourse, which only makes your life better and the country better as a whole.
Wonderful. You, of course, have a show on Amazon now, The Terminal List, but where else can our listeners follow your work, your writing, and get your new book?
Yeah, October 7th, Cry Havoc comes out. So that's the Vietnam 1968 story, and officialjackcarr.com is where people can go if they want to follow along on the social channels or listen to the podcast or anything else. So, but right now it's Cry Havoc, and it's filming this fight scene this afternoon here in Morocco, and the True Believer should come out, I would guess next summer. I'm not positive, but I would guess next summer, and we'll see what we do from there. So fingers crossed we get some more seasons and get to keep doing this. But in the meantime, Cry Havoc, October 7th.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time.